In this video, we're going to learn how to create this SVG Morph animation using React Spring. The video itself is divided into 4 different parts. In the first one, we're going to learn something about the SVG Morph animations from the theoretical standpoint. This means that we learn what SVG values needs to be animated, or like what properties needs to be animated to make one shape turn into another one. In the second part, we'll jump into a graphics editor, Figma, to create a custom SVG, which is going to help us animate it very easily. Then, in the third part, we'll finally dive into the code itself, and we're gonna see that it's pretty straightforward, like most hard work is going to be done in Figma in step number 2. And finally, in the fourth step, we're gonna learn how to create the SVG animation without the need for a custom SVG. So it's gonna be a bit more difficult in terms of programming, but at the same time, it's gonna allow us to create the animation without the need to create custom SVGs in graphic editors. Alright, so let's say we've got these two curves. One of them looks more like a frowning mouth and the other one looks like a smiling mouth. And both of them would be probably denoted by the path element in SVG. So the question is, what needs to change in the path element to turn the frowning mouth into the smiling mouth? If you take a look at the path element, you'll notice that it comprises of the D attribute, which stands for definition. It defines the shape of the path. The path itself, it's made of like several curves and lines, and these are denoted by letters and numbers. The gist of it is that letters, they denote the type of the curve, and the numbers, they define the curve dimensions or the shape of the curve, the angles. So if you want to animate one path into another, it's oftentimes best if it's got the same curve types, that means the same letters, and it only differs in the numbers, like in the angles, in the curve lengths, and so on. There is a kind of unfortunate consequence to that, and is that if you happen to have 2 random SVG files, you're not probably going to be able to animate between those very easily, because they're going to have different number of curves, like different number of points. So you'll need to make sure that they have the same number of points up front. And that is something that we're going to be having a look at in part 2. So we won't be creating the SVGs from scratch. That would be very hard and is well beyond the scope of this video. We're going to need some already existing emojis or images of emojis as templates. So we'll head over to Emojipedia, where we can find all different emojis. And we'll use the disappointed, the neutral, and the hard eyes emojis. We are going to choose Twitter variants of the emojis because they are the easiest to animate. And we're lucky because we can find the source images to all the Twitter emojis on GitHub. So if you click Assets, then SVG, you'll be presented with a list of all Twitter emojis. The names of the files correspond to the Unicode codes of respective emojis. So in order to download the images of the emojis that we want, we'll go back to Emojipedia, grab the Unicode code, and simply find it on GitHub. Then we'll simply download the SVG files and save them to our computer. Please bear in mind that these are not the final SVGs that we're going to animate. These SVGs have different number of points, so they are very hard to animate. They are simply going to serve us as templates for our own SVGs. Once we've downloaded all the SVGs, we're going to head over to Figma, create a new frame, and then we're going to paste all the images that we downloaded. We are going to make them a tiny bit larger and move them to the top of the frame. Then we'll copy them to the bottom of the frame. We'll log them, and we are going to decrease their opacity. Then we're going to zoom in to one of the emojis. We're going to press P And we're gonna start long and tedious process of something called tracking. In this context, tracking means that we're gonna track the edges of the original template of the original image to create a new one using vectors, which is then going to be exported using SVG. In this whole process, you should try to limit the number of points that you use to a minimum. That's going to make it a bit easier. But other than that, I acknowledge that this whole process can be a bit frustrating. Once you have successfully created the heart shape, you should copy it and you should place it over the eye of the next emoji. It's important that you keep the same number of points for all eyes of the emojis, and also you should try to keep the points as close to their original locations as possible. Otherwise, the animation is not going to be really smooth. You should now repeat the whole process for the last image. Copy the eye over the last eye, do not add any new points, and try to keep the points as close to their original locations as possible. So now we've got paths for all the right eyes. The left eyes, they're gonna be much easier, as you're just gonna copy the right eyes, place them over the left eyes, and press Shift H to horizontally flip the eyes. As for the mouths, we're gonna do pretty much the same. We're gonna track the first mouth using the pen tool. We will try to keep the points that we use to a minimum. And then we're gonna copy the mouths, place it over the mouths of the next emojis, and simply change the angles to get the right shape. So I believe that the hardest part, we already did that, so we can congratulate ourselves. And what we're gonna do next is create this circle, which is going to serve as the background of the emojis. We are going to copy onto the two remaining emojis as well. And once we've done that, we're gonna select all the circles. We're gonna choose the color picker and we're gonna fill the circles with the same color as the original emojis. Then we're gonna select all the eyes and mouths. We're gonna remove the stroke as we don't want any border, and we're gonna use the color picker once again. We're gonna paint them brown. And finally, for the hard eyes, we're gonna paint them red, so we're gonna use the color picker once again. Now for each of the emojis, we are going to select the mouth, the eyes, and the circle. We're gonna press Command or Ctrl G in order to group them into one group. And finally, we are going to export them as SVGs. So we're now finally ready to jump into the code. Let's first create a new React app. I'm going to use Create React App itself, but feel free to use whatever tool you like. Once everything's ready, we're going to cd into the newly created directory, open our favorite code editor, and type yarn start to start the development server. In our code editor, we're gonna first get rid of the boilerplate code, and we're gonna replace it by one of the SVGs that we've created. I already opened it, and if I view the source of the SVG, press Command C to copy it, then I'm gonna press Command V to paste it, and it should be ready to go. If you go back to your browser, you can check it and you should be able to see the SVG. Well, before we move on, there's one thing that I forgot to mention. We're going to be animating using the React Spring library, so it's a good idea to install the library. Go ahead and do it in your terminal. Now let's have a look at the SVG and let's have a look what it's made of. The first element is a circle, and that's not so interesting because it's gonna stay the same for all the emojis, so we're not going to animate it. Then there are the three path elements. The first two ones define the shape and the color of the eyes. The last one, it defines the shape and the color of the mouth. The path elements, they're much more interesting because they're different for every emoji. To be more specific, they differ in the path definition for the eyes and the mouth, and for the eyes they also differ in the color. That's represented by the fill attribute in SVG. We are going to start by animating the mouth. It is a tiny bit easier compared to animating the eyes because the mouths differ only in the path definitions and they have all the same color. What we are going to do is that we are going to create an array which is going to keep track of the path definitions for all the mouths. The first item in the array is going to be the path definition of the frowning mouth, and we can grab it by using the developer tools. The second item in the array is going to be the path definition of the neutral mouth, and we're going to do the same. We're going to open the developer tools, copy the path definition, and paste it into our code editor. And we'll do exactly the same for the last mouth. Well, the mouths are nice and ready. They are ready to be animated. But before we do that, we first need to import Animated and use Spring from the React Spring library. And we need to replace the path elements for animated.path so that they are compatible with React Spring. We'll also import useState because we're gonna keep track of the currently active index, which is going to correspond to the emoji that we're gonna be showing at the moment. In order to switch between the emojis, we're gonna simply use three different buttons, and the only purpose of these buttons is going to be to set the state to the corresponding index. And we're going to use some very basic styling in order to highlight the currently active button. If we now go back to the browser, we're going to see something like this. The very same emoji, but there's going to be some buttons underneath it. Next, we're going to use the useSpring hook, and we're going to pass an object into it. This object is going to hold the path definition of the current mouth. That means the mouth which corresponds to the active index. And React Spring library is going to return the animated props, and it's also gonna do all the heavy lifting. It's gonna animate between the path definitions smoothly. Finally, we need to replace the hard-coded path definition with the path definition that we got from useSpring. If you now switch to the browser and press the buttons, you can see that the mouth is animating. It's like magic, isn't it? Animating the eyes is going to be very similar. We're first going to focus on animating the shape of the eyes, and only then we're going to focus on animating the background color of the eyes. This time we're going to create two arrays, one for the right eyes and one for the left eyes. Then we're going to repeat the same process as we did for the mouths. We're going to open the DevTools, we're going to find the path definition of the given eye, and we're going to paste it into the array. We're going to do that for both left and right eyes, and of course we're going to do it for all three emojis. Once we're done, we're gonna introduce a new array which is gonna keep track of eye colors. We are first going to find the color of the hard eyes emoji. We're gonna copy it and we're gonna paste it as the last item in the array. Then we're gonna find the color of the eyes of one of the remaining two emojis, and we're gonna fill the remaining two items in the array. We're then going to introduce some new properties into the object that we pass into the useSpring hook. First, we're gonna pass the path definitions of the left eye and the right eye. This is going to be very similar to what we did for the mouth path definition. And on top of that, we're gonna introduce eye color property, which is going to keep track of the eye color of the current emoji. Finally, we are going to replace the hard-coded path definition or colors by what we get from animation props. Alrighty, so let's go to the browser, click the button, and oh my days, it's working. It cannot be real. It's working, isn't it? That's good news. Alright, so I'm happy that you've made it this far into this tutorial, and now it's the hardest part, or the bonus part, which is totally optional. And we're gonna learn how we can animate without the need of creating our custom SVG. So we're gonna use the original SVGs from Twitter, and we're gonna use some magic in order to make the animations work anyways. So in our browser, we're going to open the original SVGs from Twitter, from Twimojis GitHub. And I'll give you the links in the description, or you can just go to GitHub and find them yourself. So we're gonna open the DevTools in order to examine what the SVG is made of. And you'll see that unlike our emojis, this SVG is only made of two elements. There is the circle element for the emoji head, and then there is just one path element for everything else. However, this doesn't really suit our needs, as we need different path definitions for left eye, for the right eye, and for the mouth. So what we need to do is that we need to split this path definition into three different path definitions. How we are going to do that? Well, the first step is that we're going to convert this path definitions, which is written in the so-called relative form, into the absolute form, so that it's ready to be split up. In order to do that, we're gonna paste the path definition into this tool, this SVG path editor tool. I'll give you the link to it in the description of the video. And we're gonna click to convert to absolute. Then we're gonna copy the result and we're gonna paste it into the original SVG. Next, we'll open the path definition and we're gonna be looking for letter Z, because letter Z usually marks the end of one part of the path definition. So what we'll do is that we'll find the letter Z and copy whatever's in front of it, and then we're gonna paste it into our mouth's array, because that's the path definition of the mouth. We are going to repeat the very same process for the eyes. We're gonna look for the letter Z and we're gonna copy whatever's in front of letter Z. That's gonna be our left eye, and what remains, it's gonna be the right eye. Next, we'll examine the neutral emoji. It's made of four elements. One circle element, which is not interesting for us because it represents the head, and then there's two ellipse elements and one path element. While it's cool that it's got different elements for different parts of the emojis, unlike the previous one, what's not that cool is that instead of using path elements for the eyes, it uses ellipse elements for the eyes. First, let's simply copy the path definition of the mouth and paste it into the corresponding array. As for the ellipses, we are lucky because someone has already created this handy tool which is able to convert ellipses into paths. We're gonna fill out the form with values which define the shape, the dimension, and the position of the ellipse. Once we're done, we're gonna press calculate and we're gonna copy the path and we're gonna paste it into our array. We're gonna repeat the whole process with the second ellipse, with the only exception that the only property that's different for the second ellipse is the horizontal position, so it's gonna save us some work. We're gonna press calculate, copy the path and paste it into the array. Now let's move on to the last emoji. We're gonna open the DevTools and we'll see that there's three path elements. One of them corresponds to the emoji head. We're going to ignore it. The other one, it corresponds to the mouth. So we're going to copy the path definition of it and we're going to paste it into the array. And the final one, it corresponds to the two eyes. We already know how to divide one path definition into multiple path definitions. So we're just going to repeat the same process that we did for the first emoji. First, we're going to open this useful tool and we're going to paste the path. We're going to press convert to absolute, then we'll copy the result and we're going to paste it back into the original path. Then we're going to search for letter Z in the path definition and we're going to grab the first part of the path and insert it into the array. And finally, we'll grab the remaining part of the path and we're going to insert it into the second array. Before we start animating, we need to adjust the view box of the SVG in order to match the view box of the original Twitter SVG. And we also need to change the dimensions and the position of the circle. Next, we're going to install Flubber library, and this library is going to be very useful because it can interpolate between two different SVG paths. And what's cool is that the SVG paths, they don't have to have the same number of points. So how are we going to approach this animation? Well, we are going to keep track of the so-called interpolators in the use state. Interpolator is a function which takes a number from 0 to 1 as its input and returns something as output. In our case, that something is going to be the SVG path definition of our elements. We are going to use the interpolate function from Flubber in order to create those interpolators, and we're going to use React Spring to animate from 0 to 1 to ensure smooth animation. But before we start, we need to initiate our state to something, and we're going to initiate it to quote-unquote trivial interpolators. It's like a term that I made up, it's not anything official. It's simply a function which returns the path definition of the given element. Next, we are going to adjust the use Spring parameters. As we are going to use the interpolators, we want to animate from 0 to 1. We aren't going to use the interpolators for animating the color, it makes no sense, so we're also going to include color to the to property. We are going to set clamp to true, which ensures that the value never goes above 1, which we don't want because it would break our interpolator function. And we're going to set reset to true, which is going to ensure that the value, the x value, is going to reset to 0 after every animation. Then we're going to change the path definitions to make use of the interpolators. We're going to leverage the to property of Spring values, which enables us to pass interpolators as callbacks. Finally, we're going to import the interpolate function from Flubber, and we're going to change the onClick handler of the buttons. Instead of simply passing the new index to the setActiveIndex function, we're going to pass a callback. The first thing we must not forget is to return the new index, but that's not all. What we're going to do next is that we're going to set interpolators for the mouth, for the right eye, and for the left eye. The first argument of the interpolate function is the path that we're animating from. In our case, this is going to correspond to mouths at ref index. The second argument is going to be the path that we're animating to. In our case, that's going to be mouths at index. Finally, we'll pass a configuration object as the third argument. We're going to set max segment length to 0.5, and what it's going to do is going to make our animation smoother. The lower the number, the smoother the animation is, but it always comes at the cost of performance, so if it's too low, our performance is gonna suffer. We are going to repeat the same process for the right eye and the left eye. This means that we're going to pass the previous path definition as the first argument, the next path definition as the second argument, and the config object as the third argument. Well, I think we can go to the browser and we'll see what happens. Well, would you believe it? It's actually working. Oh my god, I wasn't expecting it at all. Alright, I thank every one of you very much for watching the video. I hope that my explanations were somewhat clear and I hope to see you next time. Bye.